The year was 1626, and the town of Nassau-Siegen was a powder keg of religious tension. John VIII, the ruler of Nassau-Siegen, had just made a shocking decision. He was converting to Catholicism. For a town that had been a stronghold of the Reformed faith, this was a betrayal of the highest order. John VIII had been raised in the Reformed tradition, receiving a top-notch education at Iserborn and the Noble Academy of Kassel. His grand tour took him to the intellectual centers of Geneva and Saumur, where he was steeped in the teachings of the Reformed Church. But the Arminian controversy, a heated debate within the Reformed faith, planted seeds of doubt in his mind. When he fell in love with Ernestine Yolande de Ligne, a Catholic princess, she introduced him to a Jesuit who helped sway his beliefs. In a letter to his father, John laid out his reasons for converting. He argued that the Catholic Church was ancient and had performed miracles, that the Protestant doctrine of the bondage of the will was dangerous to morality, and that if the Protestant critique of the Catholic Church were true, generations of Christians would have had no hope of salvation. His father, furious, reduced his inheritance, but fate intervened when John's father died in 1623, just as Catholic forces were gaining the upper hand in the 30 Years' War. The emperor overruled the will, and John inherited Nassau-Siegen in full. John's first act as ruler was to introduce toleration for Catholic worship while promising to maintain the Reformed Church. But in 1626, he took a drastic step. He outlawed Protestantism. The town was plunged into chaos. Swedish and imperial forces alternately conquered the region, each imposing their own religious order. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, aimed to restore stability by decreeing that the religious situation in Germany should revert to its state in 1624. For Nassau-Siegen, this meant a regime of toleration, where the Reformed were still the majority. The town began to rebuild, but the scars of war were deep. By 1815, the population of Siegen included 3,052 Reformed, 542 Catholics, and 30 Lutherans. The Reformed remained the largest group, but the town was now a patchwork of faiths, a far cry from its once monolithic Reformed identity. This was not an isolated incident. Across Germany, rulers who converted to other faiths faced similar challenges. The ruler of Bentheim, Steinfurt, and Tecklenburg converted to Catholicism in 1668, and the ruling house of Zweibrücken passed to a predominantly Lutheran line in 1680. Despite these changes, the Reformed Church remained the established faith, and the rulers could only decree toleration for their own creeds. The Palatinate, a key Reformed territory, faced even more dramatic upheavals. Its ruler, Frederick V, played a pivotal role in sparking the 30 Years' War, and in 1628, the region was occupied by Catholic forces led by Maximilian of Bavaria. The population was given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or leave. The Swedish conquest in 1631 turned the tables in favor of Lutheranism, but the region was reconquered by Catholic forces later in the war. The Peace of Westphalia restored the Palatinate to its original ruling house and its pre-1618 religious state, but the restored Reformed supremacy lasted only until 1685, when the territory passed to a Catholic branch of the family. The new Catholic rulers introduced Jesuits and Capuchins, and the French occupation during the War of the League of Augsburg heightened religious tensions. Catholic and Protestant forces battled over control of churches, and in one village, a Catholic priest, enraged by a Reformed service running overtime, shot a passerby. By the end of the century, about 2/7 of the region's churches were in Catholic hands, and about 1/6 of the population worshipped as Catholics. The Reformed retained their numerical majority, but the religious landscape was forever changed. The fate of the Reformed churches in these territories depended on the depth of their roots. In Poland, the high aristocracy's defection to Catholicism led to the collapse of the Reformed Church. In Hungary and France, the Reformed Church endured despite severe persecution. In Hungary, the lesser gentry in towns resisted Habsburg efforts to diminish their rights, while in France, many Huguenots fled abroad or defied the king to maintain their faith. The story of Nassau-Siegen and the Palatinate is a tale of religious conflict and resilience. It shows how the choices of rulers and the strength of popular faith shaped the religious landscape of 17th-century Europe. The Reformed churches, once dominant, faced challenges that tested their very existence, but in many places, they survived, a testament to the enduring power of belief. King James, who ruled both England and Scotland, had a complex relationship with the Church. His upbringing in Scotland had instilled in him a strong belief in predestination, a core Calvinist doctrine that suggests God has already chosen who will be saved and who will not. However, his experiences with Scottish Presbyterians, like Andrew Melville, and his belief in the divine right of kings made him wary of any form of church governance that might challenge his authority. At the Hampton Court Conference, James agreed to support preaching, but he was clear that he would not tolerate any changes to the power of bishops. When some Puritans tried to reform the church courts, he shut down Parliament and forced clergymen to sign a pledge supporting the existing church structure. This move led to the dismissal of about 80 Puritan ministers who refused to comply. James was also more moderate in his views on church rituals. He believed in a balance between strict Puritan practices and the more formal rituals of the English Church. In 1617, when Puritans in Lancashire tried to ban Sunday activities like dancing and piping, James stepped in. He ordered the creation of the Book of Sports, which allowed a wide range of activities after church services, including archery, May games, and Morris dances. This move was meant to ease tensions and allow people to enjoy their Sundays without feeling overly restricted. However, James's efforts to balance different factions within the church were not always successful. In 1618, he tried to bring Scottish worship practices closer to those in England by introducing the 5 Articles of Perth. These articles required communicants to kneel during the sacrament, allowed private communion and baptism, and ordered the observance of certain holidays. Many Scots, especially in regions like St. Andrews and Edinburgh, strongly resisted these changes. Some were even banished or lost their positions for refusing to comply. Despite his efforts to maintain balance, James's policies often favored the formalist wing of the church, which emphasized rituals and the importance of church traditions. He appointed bishops who supported these views and allowed Richard Montague to publish an anti-predestinarian book in 1624. This shift became even more pronounced under King Charles I, who succeeded James in 1625. Charles, a pious man with a strong sense of aesthetics, favored a church that emphasized decorum and uniformity. He appointed William Laud, a leading formalist, as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Laud and Charles worked together to enforce strict conformity to church rituals. They issued detailed instructions for improving church furnishings, erecting altar rails, and ensuring proper reverence for the church building. Bishops were ordered to be more zealous in enforcing these rules, and many clergymen were punished for nonconformity. The policies of Charles and Laud, known as the Caroline captivity of the Church, transformed public opinion. Many Puritans saw these changes as a step toward Catholicism, which they deeply feared. The presence of a Catholic queen and the celebration of Mass in her chapel at Somerset House only added to their concerns. As a result, more and more Puritans decided to leave the Church of England. Some became wandering preachers within England, while others, like John Cotton, chose to emigrate to New England. The settlement of New England began in 1618, but the major wave of migration occurred between 1628 and 1643, when about 21,000 people, including 76 ordained ministers, made the journey across the Atlantic. These migrants were free to establish churches based on their own beliefs, far from the scrutiny of the English episcopate. They drafted and swore to covenants, emphasizing the independence of each congregation. Thomas Hooker, who arrived in 1633, brought the principle of congregational independence, which became a fundamental belief in New England. In New England, church membership was restricted to visible saints, individuals who could testify to the working of grace in their souls. This practice ensured that only a small fraction of the population were full church members. Worship practices included seated communion, baptism at the front of the church without the sign of the cross, and strict Sabbath observance. The New England churches also implemented a form of parish-based discipline, where all full members shared in the disciplining and excommunication of church members. In 1648, the Massachusetts General Court convened a synod in Cambridge to codify the practices of the New England churches. The resulting church platform declared that the true visible church was congregational, not national or provincial. It called for the congregational election of ministers, a fourfold ministry, and the admission of saints by calling to church membership. Larger synods were also provided for, but their decisions were to be based on the Word of God. By restricting church membership to those who could offer testimony of saving faith, the New England Way ensured that only a fraction of residents were full church members. This led to challenges, especially as younger generations found it difficult to discern internal evidence of saving faith. By 1678, the percentage of church members in Milford had dropped to 47% of adult males. This decline led to the Halfway Covenant in 1662, which allowed the baptism of children of non-members. But many churches resisted this change, fearing it would undermine their strict standards. The New England Way represented a unique approach to church governance, one that emphasized the independence of each congregation and the importance of personal testimony of saving faith. It was a system that evolved in response to the policies of Charles I and Laud, and it shaped the religious landscape of New England for generations to come. The Puritans in New England were determined to create a society that closely followed their religious beliefs. They believed that the government and the church should work together to ensure that everyone lived according to Christian laws. This meant that the government had a duty to protect religion, uphold the laws of God, and punish those who went against Christian teachings. For example, the first law code in Massachusetts, created in 1648, included severe penalties for blasphemy, adultery, and other sins. It also required people to attend church and respect the ministers. However, the exact relationship between the government and the church varied from one colony to another. In Massachusetts and New Haven, only church members could vote or hold office. In Connecticut, all male landowners had these rights. Even though not everyone who could attend the communion table could vote, the Puritans still worked hard to make sure that the government supported the church and its teachings. Meanwhile, in Scotland, King Charles I's attempts to change the church caused a major rebellion. Charles wanted to make the Scottish church more like the English one, which was more hierarchical and had more rituals. This didn't sit well with the Scottish people, who had a strong tradition of simpler, more straightforward worship. In 1637, Charles introduced a new prayer book that included more rituals and holidays. When the book was first used in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, the people were so angry that they disrupted the service, shouting and even throwing chairs. This event sparked widespread protests across Scotland. People signed a document called the National Covenant, which was a promise to defend the purity of the Scottish Church and resist the changes Charles was trying to make. The covenant gained widespread support, and many nobles and common people signed it. They then formed an army to defend their cause. Charles tried to use force to stop the rebellion, but his army was poorly equipped and poorly led. In 1639, the Covenanters, as the rebels were called, defeated Charles's forces in the First Bishops' War. Charles then tried to get money from the English Parliament to raise a better army, but the Parliament refused to give him any money unless he addressed their grievances. This led to the Second Bishops' War in 1640, where the Covenanters again defeated Charles's forces. In Scotland, the Covenanters took control of the church and the government. They removed the bishops and established a system of church governance based on local assemblies. They also increased the church's power to discipline people who didn't follow their strict religious rules. The church became a central part of Scottish life, and people were encouraged to sign the National Covenant and live according to its principles. Back in England, Charles's failures in Scotland weakened his position. When he called a new parliament in 1640, the members were determined to challenge his policies. They were particularly critical of Archbishop Laud, who had been a key figure in Charles's religious reforms. Parliament voted to remove the altar rails and move the communion table in churches, which was a symbolic act against the more elaborate church practices that Charles and Laud had introduced. They also set up a committee to investigate and remove scandalous ministers who had promoted unpopular religious ideas. The tension between Parliament and the king grew, and by 1642, England was on the brink of civil war. The Puritans, who were a significant group in Parliament, were determined to reform the Church of England and remove the influence of the bishops. They believed that the church should be simpler and more focused on preaching and personal faith rather than elaborate rituals and a hierarchical structure. The struggle between the king and Parliament and the debates over the nature of the church would continue to shape the political and religious landscape of England and Scotland for years to come. The Puritans in New England, the Covenanters in Scotland, and the Reformers in England all shared a common goal: to create a society that lived according to their religious beliefs. However, their methods and the outcomes of their efforts would vary greatly, leading to significant changes in the way people lived and worshipped. The debates over how the church should be organized in the 17th century were intense and complex. Four main groups emerged, each with its own ideas about the best way to run the church. One group, led by James Ussher, the Archbishop of Armagh, wanted to keep bishops but change how they worked. Ussher suggested a system where bishops would still lead, but they would be part of a larger group called synods, which would make decisions together. This idea was popular at first, but as the arguments between different groups got more heated, it lost support. Another group believed that bishops were essential because they could trace their authority back to the apostles. They argued that without bishops, the church wouldn't be legitimate. Jeremy Taylor, in his book Episcopacy said that only churches with bishops could truly be called churches. A second group, called the Congregationalists, believed that each church should be independent and self-governing. They thought that each congregation should choose its own leaders and decide who could join. John Cotton, a minister in New England, wrote about this idea in books like An Apology of the Churches in New England for Church Government. These ideas spread back to England, where they gained support. John Owen, a prominent Puritan theologian, also embraced this model after reading Cotton's work. A third group, the Presbyterians, wanted a system where churches would be organized into groups called presbyteries, which would make decisions together. This system was already in place in Scotland, and many English people who wanted a unified national church without too much authority in the hands of a few leaders were drawn to it. The Presbyterians used the Bible to support their ideas and pointed to examples from the early church. The fourth group, called the Erastians, believed that the government should have control over the church. They argued that the state should decide how the church should be run, just like in ancient Israel. John Selden, a lawyer and member of Parliament, was a leading figure in this group. He believed that the Jewish state and church were one, and that in England, the Parliament should be the church. As the debates continued, political events played a crucial role. When the Civil War broke out, the bishops, who were loyal to King Charles I, were removed from their positions. Parliament, which was opposed to the king, suspended the bishops and started to change the way the church was run. They removed symbols they considered superstitious, like altars and crosses, and moved communion tables to the center of the church to create a new church order. Parliament called a meeting of leading religious figures at Westminster. The Presbyterians were the most influential group at this assembly, but they had to make compromises with the Erastians and Congregationalists. The new system they created was similar to the Presbyterian system in Scotland, but it included some elements that allowed for more local control and government oversight. The assembly also created a new order of worship and a confession of faith. The new worship guide, called the Directory for Public Worship, was a compromise between the Presbyterians, who wanted a fixed liturgy, and the Congregationalists, who preferred more spontaneous prayer. It prescribed a simple Sunday routine that included singing psalms, repeating sermons, and visiting the sick. The Westminster Confession of Faith, completed in 1647, outlined the core beliefs of the Reformed tradition, including ideas about salvation and the role of faith. It was accepted by the Scottish Church and later by some English and American Congregationalists. Despite these efforts, the new church system struggled to take hold. Many ministers and church members resisted the changes, and the system of elders and presbyteries was only partially implemented. By the time the assembly finished its work in 1647, it was clear that the new church order was having trouble getting off the ground. The Civil War in England changed the way people thought about religion. Before the war, most people in England followed the Church of England, which was controlled by the government. The government made everyone attend church and follow the same rules, but the war brought new ideas and changes. Oliver Cromwell, a powerful leader during the war, was a Puritan. He believed that God had a plan for everything, and that people should be free to practice their faith as long as they were sincere. Cromwell didn't want to force everyone to follow the same religious rules. Instead, he allowed different groups of Protestants to worship in their own ways. However, not everyone agreed with Cromwell. Some people in Parliament and in London wanted to go back to the old ways. They wanted to close down churches that didn't follow the rules and get rid of the army, which they thought was full of dangerous ideas. But when Parliament tried to disband the army without paying the soldiers, it led to a series of events that changed everything. The army took control, and Charles I, the king, was put on trial and executed. This marked the end of the idea that there should be only one way to practice religion in England. In 1650, the government made a new rule. Instead of forcing everyone to go to the same church on Sundays, people could choose where to worship. They could go to a parish church, a gathered church, or even just read the Bible at home. This didn't mean complete religious freedom, though. The government still didn't like people who believed in very extreme ideas like the Ranters, and they still wanted to control who could become a minister. Cromwell and his followers also tried to improve the quality of ministers and to make people behave better. They wanted to create a nation where people were more moral. They closed theaters, banned certain activities on Sundays, and made new laws to punish people who did bad things. But these rules were hard to enforce, and not everyone followed them. By the 1650s, there were many different ways to practice religion. Some people still used the old prayer book, while others used new methods. New churches, called gathered churches, started to form, and people could choose which one to join. Some of these churches joined together to form larger groups, like the Baptist and Congregationalist churches. Some ministers who had lost their jobs because they supported the king or didn't like the new rules continued to preach where they could. They often had the support of local people who agreed with them. This led to a mix of different religious practices, and people could choose where to worship. The changes in religion during this time were exciting for some, but troubling for others. Some ministers tried to keep things together by forming groups to discuss problems and find solutions. Others started to think about ways to bring people together around basic religious principles rather than strict rules. The Civil War and the years that followed it showed that it was hard to force everyone to follow the same religious rules. People wanted more freedom to choose how to practice their faith. When Charles II became king again in 1660, one of the big challenges was to figure out how to create a church that could bring the country together. In Scotland, the Civil War also caused a lot of division. The Scottish Church, which was Presbyterian, had a strong political influence. The main question was whether to support the king or to follow the National Covenant, which promised to defend the purity of the Church. Some Scots wanted to work with the English Parliament to change the Church, while others thought this was a mistake. When Charles I surrendered to the Scots, some wanted to make peace with him, while others thought he should promise to defend the Covenant. This led to a split in the Scottish government and the Church. The group that wanted to be stricter about the Covenant took control and tried to make the country more religious. They passed new laws to punish people who did bad things and made it harder for people to become ministers. When Charles II became king, some Scots wanted to work with him, while others thought he wasn't committed enough to the Covenant. This led to another split in the Church. Some ministers like Samuel Rutherford thought the country needed to be even stricter about the Covenant, while others were more willing to compromise. Cromwell's army eventually took control of Scotland, and the country lost its independence. This made it hard for the different groups in the Church to fight with each other. Some ministers withdrew from politics, and others joined new religious groups. The divisions in the Church didn't go away, but they became less intense under Cromwell's rule. When Charles II became king, he had to deal with these divisions and try to create a church that could unite the country. The changes during the Civil War and interregnum had shown that people wanted more freedom in their religious practices, and the new king had to find a way to balance this with the need for a unified church. The Cromwellian church order, which was in place during Oliver Cromwell's rule, gave England and Scotland a unique, decentralized, and less hierarchical church structure. However, this order lasted only as long as Cromwell's regime. When Cromwell died and the monarchy was restored with Charles II, the system quickly fell apart, and there were few people who wanted to keep it. The Restoration brought back the question of what kind of church order England and Scotland would have. There were different groups with different ideas. Some, like the Scottish and English Presbyterians, wanted a simple, strict form of worship and a church government run by elders. They were hopeful because Charles II had previously agreed to the Solemn League and Covenant, which supported their views. Another group, which included people who had supported the Book of Common Prayer and the idea of bishops, wanted to keep the old church traditions. Edward Hyde, who became a key advisor to Charles II, believed the church should be closely controlled by the state. He feared a church that could operate independently Charles II himself was more of a mystery. He seemed to dislike strict religious rules, but his experiences with the Scottish Presbyterians during the 1650s made him wary of their influence. He preferred the Book of Common Prayer and the role of bishops in the church. At first, Charles II tried to please everyone. He appointed some Puritan leaders as royal chaplains and allowed them to preach without following the liturgy. Some of these leaders, like Richard Baxter and Edmund Calamy, were even offered bishop positions, but they declined. There was a brief hope that a modified form of episcopacy, where bishops would work with elected presbyters, might be accepted. However, this hope was short-lived. The new parliament, known as the Cavalier Parliament, was strongly in favor of restoring the old church order. They quickly voted to bring back the Book of Common Prayer and burn the Solemn League and Covenant. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 was a crucial law that required all ministers to fully accept the Book of Common Prayer and swear that they would not take up arms against the king. It also required episcopal ordination for all ministers and imposed strict penalties for those who did not comply. Many ministers, especially those who had been influenced by Puritanism, found these requirements too much to bear. They refused to sign the Act of Uniformity and lost their positions. By August 24, 1662, over 1,000 clergymen had been forced to leave their churches. Some of these ministers continued to preach in secret, often risking arrest and imprisonment. Others became teachers or doctors, and some even started their own schools, which later became known as dissenting academies. The government tried to suppress these dissenting groups by passing laws that made it illegal to attend religious meetings of more than 5 people who were not from the same household. Ejected ministers were banned from living near towns or places where they had previously served. However, this persecution only increased sympathy for the dissenters, and the debate over religious tolerance grew more intense. In 1672, Charles II issued a declaration of indulgence which allowed Protestant dissenters to worship publicly if they obtained a license. This revealed just how many people were eager to worship outside the established church, with over 1,600 licenses being issued. However, the declaration was short-lived, as it faced strong opposition from Parliament, which claimed it was an illegal use of the king's power. Charles was forced to withdraw the declaration and instead pass the Test Act, which required all civil and military officials to take communion in the established church. In Scotland, the restoration of the church was also difficult. Charles II initially seemed willing to accept a Presbyterian church order, but as he realized that many nobles were tired of the strict control of the church, he decided to restore the bishops. This led to a new church system that was similar to the one before the Revolution, with kirk sessions, presbyteries, and synods operating under episcopal supervision. Many Scottish ministers refused to accept this new order, and about 270 of them lost their positions. This led to the formation of secret conventicles, where people would gather to worship in defiance of the law. The government's response to these conventicles was harsh. They imposed heavy fines and used soldiers to collect them. In 1666, a group of dissenters known as Whigs attacked a group of soldiers and marched toward Edinburgh, hoping to spark a larger uprising. This became known as the Pentland Rising, and it ended with the execution of 36 people and the transportation of 80 more to the colonies. Despite these efforts, the Restoration did not achieve the religious unity that Charles II and his advisors had hoped for. Instead, it created a divide between the established church and the growing number of dissenters who worshipped outside it. This divide would continue to shape religious and political life in England and Scotland for many years to come. In England, the years following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 saw a pattern of alternating periods of strict control and periods of more lenient treatment of religious dissenters. The Pentland Rising in 1666, a rebellion against the government's religious policies, led the Crown to rely less on military force to enforce church attendance. This change in approach initially reduced tensions, but it also allowed dissenting religious groups to grow and become more organized. In 1669, the government issued a series of declarations of indulgence, which allowed some ministers who had been removed from their positions to return to their parishes without fully rejoining the established church. This move brought back about 80 ministers, but it also allowed dissenting religious meetings, known as conventicles, to continue and even increase in number. By 1674, these meetings had become so bold that a group of field preachers gathered in Edinburgh to establish a system for appointing new ministers and setting up their own church courts. This laid the groundwork for a separate, schismatic church, though it took time to fully form. Faced with growing opposition, the authorities responded with a harsh crackdown. A new law required landlords to ensure that their tenants and servants followed the established church. When this proved difficult to enforce, troops were once again deployed. To protect themselves, conventicles grew larger and more organized. One meeting in 1678 on Skeach Hill, near Dumfries, was attended by 14,000 people, surrounded by armed guards on horseback. In one parish, most of the residents attended these field meetings. When a minister tried to stop one parishioner from attending, the man called the minister a soul murderer and said he had gained more from the conventicles than from the minister's sermons in 18 years. The government responded to this defiance by stationing Highland militiamen in affected parishes, similar to the dragonnades in France. Arrests led to prison raids, and in May 1679 a group of rebels captured and killed the Archbishop of St. Andrews, James Sharp, on a remote road. This marked a turning point in the conflict. The following year, a small group led by the minister Richard Cameron signed a covenant pledging to defend a church free from state control. They formally renounced their allegiance to King Charles II, but Cameron was soon killed by royal troops. Despite this, the Cameronian party continued to publish manifestos and launch attacks, even in 1684. The use of military force eventually suppressed the Cameronians and brought an end to the conventicles by 1686, but not before many lives were lost. The situation became even more complex with the accession of the Catholic King James II in 1685. His attempts to suspend penalties against both dissenters and Catholics alarmed those who feared the rise of Catholicism and arbitrary rule. James's efforts to alter local government and build a standing army further increased tensions. When his queen became pregnant with a potential Catholic heir, William III of Orange, a leader of the anti-French coalition, saw an opportunity to intervene. Invited by a group of collaborators, William launched a successful invasion that led to James II's abdication. The Convention Parliament then offered the throne to William and his wife Mary, making William a Dutch Reformed king and Mary an Anglican queen. William, with his background in the Dutch Reformed Church, was open to religious tolerance. He received prominent dissenters warmly and proposed broadening the established church to include more reformed elements. However, this idea was met with strong opposition from high Anglicans who valued the church's traditions and episcopal structure. In 1689, Parliament passed the Toleration Act, which allowed dissenters to worship freely as long as they swore an oath of loyalty to the new monarchs. However, the act did not apply to Catholics or anti-Trinitarians, and the Test Act remained in place. With legal restrictions lifted, dissenters began to build public meeting houses and establish a more stable presence. By the early 18th century, there were about 355,000 dissenters, or 6% of the population of England and Wales. They were particularly numerous in areas with a history of Puritanism, regions with large parishes and textile manufacturing areas. Theologically, Congregationalists and particular Baptists maintained a strong Calvinist tradition, while Presbyterians faced an identity crisis after 1689, and some moved toward Congregationalism or liberal theology. The established Church of England struggled to adapt to the loss of its monopoly on worship. William appointed bishops who were more open-minded, but this created tension with the parish clergy, who were more conservative. The publication of works, like John Toland's Christianity, Not Mysterious, and John Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity, further challenged traditional beliefs. High Church Anglicans, who valued the rituals and doctrines of the Church, demanded greater independence from the state and the revival of clerical convocations. This led to conflicts within the Church, particularly over issues like heresy and the practice of occasional conformity. By the early 18th century, the sense of the Church in danger had diminished, but the division between High and Low Church Anglicans persisted. High Church Anglicans emphasized the beauty of the Church's rituals and the importance of a consecrated clergy, while Low Church Anglicans leaned toward rational theology and a closer relationship with continental Protestant churches. In Scotland, the Glorious Revolution brought significant changes to the established Church. The Scottish Parliament's claim of right, which offered the throne to William and Mary, condemned episcopacy, since all the Scottish bishops refused to swear allegiance to the new monarchs. William had little choice but to support the Presbyterian cause. This led to the restructuring of the Church in Scotland, where the Presbyterian system was firmly established and episcopacy was abolished. The Glorious Revolution thus marked a turning point in the religious landscape of both England and Scotland, leading to a more pluralistic and tolerant society, but also creating new divisions and challenges within the established churches. By the end of the 17th century, the landscape of Reformed Christianity in Europe looked very different from what it had been 100 years earlier. The number of Reformed believers hadn't changed much, but where they lived and how they practiced their faith had shifted dramatically. In Eastern Europe, the Reformed faith had weakened in places like Hungary and almost disappeared in Poland, Lithuania. In France, the Huguenots, who had already been losing members, faced even more challenges after 1685, when the king revoked their legal rights, forcing many to leave the country or convert to Catholicism. The Reformed faith in Transylvania, once a stronghold, lost its privileged status when the region came under Habsburg control. The Palatinate, another important Reformed area, saw the arrival of new Catholic and Lutheran communities due to wars and a change in leadership. Despite these losses, the Reformed faith found new strength in other parts of Europe. Switzerland, the British Isles, the Netherlands, and Brandenburg, Prussia became the main centers of Reformed Christianity. In these places, the Reformed churches not only survived, but thrived, often growing in numbers and influence. However, the Reformed tradition also became more diverse and sometimes divided. In theology, there were debates over predestination and election, with some advocating for strict Calvinist views and others for more moderate positions. The rise of rationalism and new philosophical ideas added to these debates, challenging traditional beliefs and practices. Worship practices also varied widely. In England, the conflict between those who preferred the Book of Common Prayer and those who favored a simpler, more reformed style of worship led to the creation of multiple churches. In Scotland, the struggle between Presbyterians and Episcopalians resulted in two separate church systems, each with its own form of governance and liturgy. Ecclesiology, or the study of church structure, became another area of contention. In Britain, the old compromise between Episcopal and Presbyterian forms of church government broke down. The Puritans, who had once been part of the Church of England, now formed their own denominations, including Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists. In Scotland, the divide between Episcopalians and Presbyterians hardened into two distinct and often opposing groups. The Reformed churches in Europe had to adapt to these changes. Some, like the Scottish Episcopalians, faced legal and social challenges but managed to survive and even grow. Others, like the English dissenters, found new ways to express their faith outside the established church. In the end, the Reformed tradition in Europe at the close of the 17th century was more complex and diverse than ever before. The old dream of a single, unified, Reformed church had given way to a reality of multiple, often competing denominations. But despite these divisions, the Reformed faith continued to shape the religious and cultural life of Europe, influencing everything from politics to education to daily worship. This period marked a turning point in the history of Reformed Christianity, setting the stage for the challenges and opportunities that would come in the centuries ahead.